All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. Today we're going to be talking about an awesome new cool toolkit called Empower. Or the webinar is called Empowering Impact Grounding in Research and Data Toolkit. And if you all are not familiar with CAE, our mission is to advance environmental education in Colorado by fostering collaboration, mobilizing support, and driving excellence. One CAE member reaches over 900 learners, and there is about 850 CAE members that reach for 800,000 learners across the state. And there's a lot of great upcoming events that we have going on. So February 7th is the start of the EE Teaching Practices cohort, and I believe registration ends soon. So if you're interested in that, check it out and be sure to get registered for that. April 12th is our spring conference, and that will be held in Breckenridge. So if you're on the Western Slope or in any of the mountain areas, you could definitely come and join us. I think it's going to be a really awesome event. And then later on in September will be our annual Advancing EE conference, and that will be September 19th and 20th, and that will be in Denver, Colorado. I think we're all very familiar with Zoom, but just a quick few reminders to just keep your line muted while others are speaking. You can use the chat function to send a message to the presenters or to all the participants. And if you'd like to, you can add in your name, organization, or where where you're connecting from. And just as a reminder, you will receive a recording for today. All right, that's all I have. I'm going to pass it over to Katie.
Awesome. Well, hello everyone. I'm excited to share this new report with you. And I will say, as I was digging in here and trying to think about what to talk about, I had a really hard time. There was so much in here to think about. So we're going to take it from one angle today, but know that there's a lot to explore. So hopefully this will be something that you can use, whether you're trying to tell your story to a funder or a key stakeholder or whoever that is. Before we jump in and get started, I do want to give a little shout out to all the folks who were involved in really creating these resources and bringing them to life. Blue Lotus Consulting and Evaluation was the evaluation team we worked on when we first started envisioning some of these evaluation and storytelling tools. And Point B Strategies is the evaluation team that specifically worked on this report and put a ton of research power into it. So we're super grateful for their support in helping us create this. And then Pisces Foundation provided a lot of the funding that helped us put these tools together. So what I'm hoping to do today is to start with outcomes and really be thinking about what is the biggest impact that you're making in your program. And this is something I think that people should do often and over again, because that changes as you make tweaks to your program. And understanding where you make the biggest impact is going to help you tell a better story. It's going to help you make sure that you're measuring the right things. And we found that in doing a lot of this work, when we ask people kind of what outcomes they think they're achieving, and then when they really dig into the outcomes, they recognize a lot more that they could be looking at. And so always want to take some time to do that and really dig in and think about the powerful work that you are all doing. We're gonna spend just a few minutes overviewing the toolkit and what's inside it, and what you can find in there. And then we're going to dig into and spend the majority of our time really thinking about how do we tell success stories of environmental and outdoor learning, and how do we use state and regional data to do that, and how do we use some of the research around program practices to do that. And then we'll close up with some where you can find these tools and some additional tools that we're not going to talk about today that you might also want to dig into. So that's the plan. So to get us started, again, we're going to start with where are you making the biggest impact? So I'd love for you to take 60 seconds to think about that for your organization, your programs. We know you are doing amazing work. We know that you are moving learners along a journey to environmental literacy. We know you're connecting them to nature. But what jumps out to you as the biggest impact that you are making? So go ahead and jot down some notes, and I'll pause for another 30 seconds here just to let you reflect. Great. I'm going to ask Brianna if you can help me by we're going to get into small groups, and I'd like you to share where you feel like you're making the biggest impact. But I'd also like you to talk about what's challenging about telling that story. Like, uh, what what do you run into, and what's hard to make sure that our stakeholders know? Um, so if you can put us in groups of around three, that would be great. And Brianna, it looks like we might need to move Donnie into room three. Second. So if we want to hit the record.
Perfect.
Awesome. Welcome back. Is there anybody who'd be willing to share something that's challenging about telling the story of your impact? Well, that's okay. I will say, I know for me, I think there are a couple things that jump out as challenging right away. When we're talking about outdoor and environmental learning, a lot of the problems that we are trying to solve, we can't measure if we've solved them or not. You know, we are working towards better environmental quality sometimes, and uh, it's hard to make the leap from how someone is building their, say, intention to take environmentally responsible behaviors from that intent all the way to how does that improve our environmental quality? How does that improve our education? Um, the dotted line is there, but it's hard to draw that direct line. And I think that's something, at least for me, that has been very challenging when we're trying to make that connection, particularly to the stakeholders who might not be focused on environmental education or really understand all the ins and outs of it. Anybody else have anything that jumped out? Some agreement there? Well, what we tried to do with this toolkit is to put together some resources that might help connect those dots or help lessen your workload, that you can pull out some things that might help with your communicating when you're telling your story. So in the toolkit, there are really three different things. One is we did a lit review of research-based practices. So what in the literature, in the research is saying, when I do this, these things happen. So for those things that are harder to draw a straight line, how can we use the research? So you can say the research says when you do X, this happens, and I'm also doing X. So you can make that jump, and hopefully this makes that a little easier to find. The second thing that's in there is we looked at, over the last 5 years, we've been collecting information about what people in Colorado uh, want to understand about their programs, what they want to measure, what they want to evaluate. And we looked at all those things and we said, what publicly available data relates even kind of to those things? And how can we use that um, in our storytelling? And so we found those data sources that you can then dig into and make connections back to what's happening in your programs. And then the third thing we did in this report is provide some storytelling tools that can help, especially when you're talking to an audience that may or may not be in environmental education or environmental and outdoor learning every day. Maybe they really care about conservation, but you're trying to make the connection between conservation and environmental and outdoor learning. What are some metaphors? What are some storytelling tools that you can use that help make that connection stronger? And those came from work with the Frameworks Institute, who are experts in figuring out how to do that social change communication. So just to give you an idea of how the report is lined out, so we have 5 big outcome areas that we focus on, or that we think environmental education helps support. So one of those you can see, for example, is conservation. So for each of those 5 big buckets, whether it's conservation, education, positive youth development, health and wellness, or social justice, there's a couple different things. We start out by kind of in each section, how does environmental and outdoor learning support conservation efforts? Then we list out a couple practices that we found in the literature that tend to lead to conservation outcomes. So you can right away see, is this something we engage in? This list is not all inclusive, but there are things that showed up in the literature over and over again. Then we have some existing resource or research and citations, so that hopefully there's some things that you can pull out and plug right into your grant proposals, grant requests, handouts that you're making for stakeholders, wherever you're trying to build the case, that hopefully there are some things in there that can work for you. There's kind of a big section on the overarching impact area and why conservation is important that might help you set the scene. And then there's specific information about what practices in environmental and outdoor learning lead to those outcomes. Then again, we lead into data sets. Where can you find data for your community or for the state that might help you either describe the problem that you have, or describe kind of where your learners are at? You can find that here, and there are a number of data sets that you can explore, and we'll talk more about this. And then finally, there is an example of how you might tell the story and how you might insert some of your data into the story you're telling. And you can see there are little call out boxes that highlight some of the different tools that you might use to tell that story. So that's kind of the layout of the toolkit once you get in there and start digging around. And Brianna, I'll just ask you to throw the link to the grounding and research and data report right in the chat. So feel free to dig in and explore while we're talking. We want this time to be useful for you. So if you just want to get in there and explore, you can do that. There are a number of ways that I see us using this. So we're not going to dig deep into this today, but I think, as we start to look at some of this publicly available data, one of the things we can do as an EE community is start pulling out some of that data and as a community having conversations about what's the story behind that data. How can environmental education contribute to helping support the results that we want to see, and thinking about, are there things that we should be doing differently? And so I think, as we explore what data is here and where we can go with it, there's a lot more we can do and do together as a network, beyond using it to tell our story. But today we're going to focus on how do we tell our story. So as we kind of walk through the toolkit and some storytelling tools, I'd just like you to pick out a stakeholder that you are thinking about. So maybe it's a grant you need to write. Um, and so you've got a particular funder in mind and that's on your list. Maybe it's a grant report you need to write. Maybe it's you're having a meeting with a school district representative to talk about how to embed your programs. Whoever that might be, just take a moment to kind of fix that in your mind. If you're willing, I'd love for you to share who you're thinking about in the chat. But take a few minutes and then you can think about them as we go through the rest of the webinar. All right. So again, back to the outcomes that we're talking about. So for the stakeholder that you picked out, just think about what is most important to them. And there might be multiple buckets that are most important to them, but maybe there's one that you might lead with when you're talking to them. What's kind of at the top of their list. When we really had conversations and asked people about what their stakeholders cared about and what were the big buckets of outcomes that environmental and outdoor learning achieves, they fell into these 5 buckets. So conservation, those stakeholders who want all Colorado ecosystems to be healthy, vibrant, and valued. Education is folks that want all pre-K through 12 students to be lifelong learners with successful school outcomes. Positive youth development. We want all children and youth in Colorado to be able to grow into responsible, resilient, engaged citizens that care for themselves, the environment, and their communities. Or do they care about health and wellness, that all Coloradans are healthy and well, physically, mentally, and emotionally? Or are they focused on social justice and really want all Coloradans to have an opportunity for and access to experience the outdoors? And of course, environmental and outdoor learning cannot solve any of these on their own, but we do contribute to helping reach these goals. So when we look at telling a story, I think, and whether it's writing a grant report, writing a grant application, or putting together a presentation, there's a general progression of the stories we want to tell. And the Frameworks Institute has guidance, and we'll share this link out following the webinar so you can dig in more if you want to. They have a ton of great resources. But I think when they talk about telling success stories of your organization, there are these 5 key elements to it. Making sure we tell about the setting. What's the problem that we want to be solved? The important part about this component is that we start with the why. So we don't start with the problem, we start with what we want the world to look like. In order to make sure our communities are thriving, we need environmental and outdoor learning experiences. However, there isn't access to them in our community, whatever that problem looks like. But we want to start with what we want it to look like. Who's involved? The right group came together to solve this problem, or we're bringing these people together to solve this problem. An action. This group is going to put in an effort using its skills and know-how. An outcome. Things changed for the better, or if it's an application, here's how things will change for the better. And then we want to make sure we have the moral to our story, what we can learn from it, or how we can expand that impact. So those are kind of the 5 elements. So we're going to talk through this process using the data that's in the report. So the Frameworks Institute kind of has 3 frameworks or themes for success stories. You'll notice they all start with together. Whoever you're talking about, you want to make sure that they are included, that the funder is included, that the school district is included, whoever you're talking to. So the victory story is together we stopped the problem from causing harm. The ingenuity story is together we solved a puzzle that unlocks new possibilities. And the progress story is together we moved forward towards an important goal. To me, that one resonates the most with outdoor and environmental learning. It's unlikely that we are going to solve all conservation issues or education issues after one program, but we can make some progress. So that one at least really resonates with me. So starting through the process here, we're going to go through a progress story and move towards an important goal. So when we set the setting, there's a couple things we want to remember. Again, we want to start with why. What do we want the conditions to be? And then when we frame the problem, we do want to be very careful about how we frame the problem. So you'll notice these first 2 bullets are talking about similar things. Maybe the problem is the teachers don't have the knowledge and skills they need to provide outdoor learning experiences. Or the problem is our school system doesn't provide for training for outdoor learning. And you'll notice I crossed off the one that was directed, the first one, and left the second one. Does anybody have any thoughts about why we might want to frame it the way the second bullet is framed rather than the first bullet?
It puts the responsibility on the school system.
Absolutely. I think whenever we frame a problem, we want to put responsibility on the system rather than individuals, because our reader or our listener will make up reasons why teachers don't have the knowledge and skills. And those may be the reasons we want them to think, but they may not be. And so I think whenever we can frame problems around systems, that's going to help us tell our story better. Or the problem might be something like about your environmental conditions in your community if you're working towards uh, environmental outcomes. And so this is where the state and regional data in the toolkit can be a tool for you. And you can start pulling out data that somebody else is collecting to help you paint the picture of whatever that issue is. And just to give you a quick glance at what this looks like in the toolkit, you'll see for each different data source, gives you the link so that you can get and explore. And I will say most of the data sets, not all of them, but most of them that we included provide both statewide and some regional data. Some even break down into county. So you can get in and really explore and pull out data for your region in some cases that might help you paint a picture of what's happening in your community. So this example, you can see is if we wanted to use state testing as a data set, say you're doing programming that relates to science education, you will see in 2021, we pulled out just some examples of some of the data. In 2021, only 26% of students in Colorado in 8th grade were met or exceeded expectations for science. That's pretty low. And then you can tell the story of how you can help support or change that trend, or how your programs might be helping to support those learners in achieving those results. And there's a number of different data sources in there. Just to give you an idea, just some examples of some of the data that's in there. The Healthy Kids Colorado survey has a ton of great stuff that I think we can use to pull from. This one that I think is interesting is that only 50% of students think what they're learning is going to be important later in life. A lot of us are doing programming about very relevant community issues that could be very relevant to students' lives. So something we can pull out and use. Positive youth development had, again, this is also from the Healthy Kids Colorado survey, but how many kids feel that they belong at their school? How many kids are trying to do their best work in school? Like this type of data would be great, particularly if you have longer term programs where you're seeing kids over time and they're developing a connection with adults in an educational setting. Or if you have programs that are helping them build confidence so that they can do their best work in school. Great data to pull out. In health and wellness, there's great data. This is from the Healthy Kids Colorado survey, but there's also data on adults in terms of health. But if you are doing things in social emotional learning, 50% of students, only 50% of students have a manageable stress level. Only 37% of students are eating vegetables 1 or more times a day in the last 7 days. There's some statistics about physical activity, statistics about screen time. 74% of students are spending over 3 hours in front of a screen and doing something other than schoolwork. In terms of social justice, this data is one of the few data sets that is not broken down by region. So we only have the statewide data, but it talks to barriers to accessing the outdoors and what barriers most people face when getting into the outdoors. Conservation, I would say, is kind of the deepest rabbit hole when it comes to data because there is so much data. So it really depends on what you're looking at and getting into the specifics of your community. But you can see I just pulled out a couple of maps here where you can look at if you're a community in Pueblo, and you can see that that's one of the communities that is the most burdened by pollution and climate. Or you can look at the map and see um, Colorado Springs has a high quantity of impaired streams and rivers. So if you're doing any type of water education, that might be data that helps tell the story about your community and really helps create that setting for your story. So we linked all these data sets in there, hopefully for you it to make it easier for you to find some of this data. Characters we won't dive into too much, but you want to make sure and tell the story about who's working together on that. And as one of your characters, you always want to have whoever you're telling the story to is one of those characters. So your funder is one of the people that is helping make this happen. Action, the meat of the story. What are you doing? What is it, a field trip? Is it a way that, what intervention are you doing to help solve this problem? This story could be, we updated things. We embraced a new strategy. We gave a new approach a try. We all contributed different skills to tackle the problem. There's lots of ways to frame how you're telling the story of the action that you took. And this is where you can really dive into some of those research-based practices and the lit review, particularly if there isn't state and regional data that applies to you. This is a good place to pull in other data and say, we know we're getting to the outcomes you want because we're doing the practices that the literature says are going to be important for meeting those outcomes. So I'm going to attempt to launch a poll here and see if this works. But let's just take a few minutes, and no right or wrong answers. But these are the practices that we pulled out of the research. So just go ahead and go through and answer the questions, and which practices jump out to you that your programs are doing that you might be able to use the research in this report to tell your story. We'll give you about 1 more minute. All right, I'm going to close this poll and we'll just take a look at the results here. Looks like lots of folks have practices in the that reach conservation outcomes. Lots of folks have education outcomes. Definitely some positive youth development outcomes. A few with some health and wellness outcomes, and a few with social justice outcomes. Awesome. Well, hopefully that gives you just a little sense of what research is in the report. And if you are using some of those practices, you can go in and see if there's anything that you might be able to pull for grant reports or grant applications, presentations, things like that, to help build a case for why you do the work that you do the way that you do it. Awesome. So moving a little bit deeper into our story, after we've explained what we do, we get to tell how things either will change or how they did change for the better. And this is where you get to share your data from evaluations, any data that you have from your program. And depending on your context in your program, you might be able to compare your data to state and regional data and really thinking about how you might use that data. Some of it is not comparable, but you might go through your evaluation and see if there are questions that maybe you could tweak a little bit or that you might want to use if you would like to compare that 75% of your program participants think the things that they are learning through your program are going to be more important in life, whereas only 50% of Colorado teens think what they're learning at school is going to be important. So think about, when we went through some of the examples of some of the data that's in there, if there are things you might be able to add or tweak in your evaluation to be able to make some of those comparisons, because those can be really powerful when your program is having better results than we're seeing either in your state or in your region. And again, just to give you a little sense of the outcomes that we looked at when we started looking across all the state and national or regional data to see what would be relevant and what might be comparable. These are the things that we're looking at that we heard from our community. So things like increase in connection to nature. And I will say it's not there yet, but the Healthy Kids Colorado survey is adding a question about time spent in nature. So hopefully in the next 2 years, they only do that survey every other year, but we'll have some statewide data about how much time kids are spending in nature. So that's an example of where hopefully we'll see some of that data. But this just gives you a taste of kind of what we were looking at when we were looking at some of those questions to see what might be comparable. And then finally, when we're telling our story, we want to make sure we include the moral. And I know when I write grant reports and grant applications, this is a piece I frequently miss. I frequently miss the why at the beginning and the moral at the end. And I think um, learning from some of the work that the Frameworks Institute has done, those are two of the most important parts because they set your vision for where you want to go and what you're really trying to achieve and make sure that you're bringing your stakeholder, whoever you're talking to, into that and make sure they're included. So in the moral, it's how do we work together to do this? When you give us this grant, we're going to be able to reach more students. When you by doing this work together, we learned that we could do X or improve learning in this way. But it's this part is really about how you did that work together and making sure that that funder, that key stakeholder, is a part of the process. And I am definitely guilty of forgetting that part when I'm telling the story of what happened as a result of a program. And I think the other piece about this is to, oh, even when you're reporting, always to kind of leave that open door for what more we could do um, with more funding, with more support, with more time, those types of things. So before, I'm going to give us maybe just 5 minutes before we just kind of review some of the tools here. But Brianna, if you could throw us back into groups and we'll just spend about 5 minutes just kind of reflecting on how you might use this data. What jumped out to you? What seems useful? What doesn't seem useful? All of those types of things. But how might you be able to use this? Or, what resources did you not see that might be really helpful to folks? Recording, Brianna. Awesome. Well, welcome back. Before we close up, I just wanted to share a couple of the other tools that you will find that are also part of our collective outcomes toolkit that Point B Strategies helped us put together. There are 5 different modules, I guess. They're free and available on the website. There's one on just finding the outcomes for your program and really kind of going through, and there's a worksheet that you can go through and work with your team to figure out what are the best outcomes for you. If you're designing an EE evaluation and want to dig into how to create a logic model and an evaluation plan, there's a toolkit. And then there's the finding the EE evaluation tools. We did a huge survey of everything that's publicly available out there that we could find and kind of aligned them under those 5 buckets of outcomes. So if you're wanting to measure conservation outcomes, you can look and see which tools might fit your needs or that you can take and then adapt to meet your needs. I always recommend those starting with the outcomes before you jump into the tools to make sure you get the right tools. Then there is a toolkit on how to tell your story with data. And today we kind of walked through some of that process, but the tools there go a lot deeper into the actual language that you can use, and what might be helpful for reaching particularly some of those audiences who might not get it right away. And then the fifth one is the grounding in research and data toolkit that we talked about today. And there is a whole document that is up on the website on how to tell a more effective story about environmental education. And so that dives deep into some of the different metaphors you can use depending on your audience and things that have been tested that work really well to help people make connections. So that's available as well. And then I think that is all I have on my agenda today. So I so appreciate everybody coming out to learn about data. I'm going to stick around, and if you have any questions, feel free to unmute and ask.